November 29th, 1944. Frenchman Bay, Bar Harbor, Maine. 0347 hours. The icy Atlantic waters lapped against rocky Maine coastline. A German U-boat's conning tower broke the surface, 3 miles offshore, its dark silhouette barely visible against the pre-dawn darkness. Inside the submarine's cramped forward compartment, 2 men prepared for what they knew would likely be their final mission. For the Reich, Erich Gimpel adjusted his waterproof coat, his fingers trembling. William Colepaw checked their leather satchel, one final time. The bag contained $60,000, American currency, radio equipment, forged identification papers, months of meticulous preparation. By the Abwehr intelligence service, the rubber raft bobbed violently in the November swells, its black surface invisible against the dark water. Both men had been trained to expect immediate capture, followed by torture and execution. Nazi intelligence briefings painted America as a nation of savage interrogators who showed no mercy. To enemy agents, they believed American civilians harbored deep hatred. For Germans, that recognition of their true identity would result in immediate violence, possibly lynching by angry mobs. What they could not have anticipated. Within hours of their landing, they would be reduced to tears, not by American brutality, but by acts of kindness, so profound. They would question everything, the woolen blanket that Harvard Hodgkins would offer. Later that morning would become more than simple protection. Against the Maine winter, it would represent the fundamental contradiction between Nazi ideology and American values. In the warmth of that simple gesture lay the seeds of understanding that democratic societies possessed strengths totalitarian regimes could neither comprehend nor duplicate, strengths rooted not in racial superiority or military might, but in basic human decency, that flourished when individuals were free to act according to their conscience, rather than state ideology. This moment of unexpected humanity on the windswept coast of Maine represented something far more significant than the capture of enemy spies. It embodied the collision between 2 incompatible worldviews, one based on hatred, suspicion, and racial hierarchy, the other founded on principles of human dignity that extended even to those who sought to destroy the very society that protected such values. For Gimpel and Colepaw, the experience of receiving kindness from the very people they had been trained to spy upon would initiate a psychological transformation that challenged every assumption about American character that Nazi propaganda had instilled in German minds. The woolen threads of a Maine fisherman's blanket would prove stronger than the ideological chains that had bound these men to a cause they would soon realize was morally bankrupt. The German intelligence operation that had placed these 2 agents on the Maine coast was part of a desperate final attempt by the Abwehr to gather information about American nuclear research and industrial production capabilities. By November 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of a 2-front war that had exhausted German resources and morale. The successful Allied landings in Normandy had opened a second European front that German forces could not contain, while the Red Army advanced relentlessly through Eastern Europe toward the German heartland. Heinrich Himmler and other Nazi leaders understood that Germany's only hope for avoiding total defeat lay in acquiring intelligence about American strategic capabilities that might provide leverage for negotiating a separate peace with the Western Allies. Operation Elster, as the mission was designated, represented one of the last serious attempts by Nazi Germany to conduct espionage operations within the continental United States. The Abwehr had spent months planning the infiltration, selecting agents with language skills and cultural knowledge necessary to blend into American society. Gimple had been chosen for his technical expertise in radio communications and his ability to gather intelligence about American industrial facilities. Kolpa, an American citizen who had defected to Germany after being discharged from the U.S. Navy for disciplinary reasons, was expected to provide local knowledge and authentic American identity. The selection of Maine as their landing site reflected German intelligence assessments that the remote northeastern coastline would provide the best opportunity for clandestine infiltration without detection. German U-boats had successfully landed saboteurs on Long Island in 1942 during Operation Pastorius, but that mission had ended in complete failure when the agents were captured within days of their arrival. Nazi intelligence planners believed that the Maine coast, with its numerous small harbors and isolated fishing communities, would offer better prospects for avoiding immediate detection. The broader strategic situation in November 1944 made such espionage missions increasingly desperate measures by a regime that was running out of conventional military options. German industrial production had been severely disrupted by Allied bombing campaigns that targeted synthetic fuel plants, aircraft factories, and transportation networks. The Wehrmacht was facing critical shortages of fuel, ammunition, and replacement personnel. That made sustained defensive operations increasingly difficult. Most critically, German intelligence services had become aware that the United States was developing some form of revolutionary weapon that could potentially end the war before German scientists could complete their own advanced weapons programs. Nazi intelligence had pieced together fragmentary evidence, suggesting that American scientists were working on a project of unprecedented scope and secrecy, involving facilities in Tennessee, New Mexico, and Washington State that consumed enormous quantities of electrical power and employed thousands of highly qualified personnel. German physicists understood the theoretical possibility of releasing nuclear energy for military purposes, but they had been unable to determine whether American research had progressed beyond theoretical studies to practical weapons development. Gimple's mission included specific instructions to gather information about unusual industrial activities, power consumption patterns, and personnel movements that might indicate the location and progress of American nuclear research. The two agents who struggled against the Maine surf in the pre-dawn darkness of November 29th carried with them not just German intelligence requirements, but the hopes of Nazi leaders who still believed that superior German science and determination could overcome American industrial advantages. They had been conditioned to view Americans as racially inferior beings, whose apparent technological progress was actually dependent on stolen German innovations and the exploitation of Jewish intellectuals who had fled the Reich. Nazi propaganda had taught them that American society was fundamentally weak and divided, lacking the cultural unity necessary to sustain a prolonged war effort against racially superior Germanic peoples. This ideological conditioning had created expectations about American behavior that would be immediately challenged. By their first encounters with Maine residents, German agents had been trained to expect Americans to react to suspected enemies with the same brutal efficiency that German security services employed against captured foreign agents. The Gestapo's treatment of captured Allied spies involved systematic torture, prolonged interrogation under conditions designed to break psychological resistance, and eventual execution in ways calculated to deter other potential agents. German intelligence briefings had warned that American law enforcement would employ similar methods, possibly supplemented by mob violence, from civilians who had been whipped into anti-German hysteria by wartime propaganda. Instead, the reality of American behavior would prove so contrary to Nazi expectations that both agents would initially refuse to believe that the kindness they encountered was genuine, rather than an elaborate psychological warfare technique designed to extract information through false friendship. The cognitive dissonance created by experiencing compassion where they expected brutality would initiate a process of ideological reevaluation that would ultimately lead both men to renounce their Nazi allegiances and cooperate fully with American authorities. Harvard Hodgkins, the 17-year-old son of a local lobsterman, was walking to work at a nearby cannery when he encountered the two strangers struggling along Route 1 in the early morning hours of November 29th. The teenager's immediate reaction to seeing two men walking in business suits during a Maine snowstorm revealed character traits that Nazi ideology insisted were impossible. In a racially mixed democracy, rather than suspicion or hostility, Hodgkins felt genuine concern for their welfare and a spontaneous desire to provide assistance to fellow human beings in distress. The woolen blanket that Hodgkins retrieved from his family's truck was hand-knitted by his grandmother from wool produced by local sheep, representing generations of Maine maritime culture that valued self-reliance, community cooperation, and assistance to those in maritime distress. The blanket's gray and blue pattern had been passed down through 3 generations of the Hodgkins family, each thread carrying the accumulated wisdom of people who understood that survival in harsh coastal environments required mutual assistance that transcended national, racial, or ideological boundaries. The wool itself had been sheared from sheep that grazed on rocky pastures overlooking Frenchman Bay, processed at local mills that had operated since the early 1800s, and knitted during long winter evenings by hands that had crafted similar blankets for countless sailors, fishermen, and travelers who had needed protection against the unforgiving Maine climate. When Hodgkins wrapped that blanket around Gimple's shoulders, he was unconsciously demonstrating democratic values that Nazi racial theory claimed were genetically impossible. In heterogeneous societies, the act required no deliberation, no consultation with authorities, no consideration of potential rewards or punishments. It emerged spontaneously from moral instincts that had been shaped by New England cultural traditions, emphasizing individual responsibility, community solidarity, and the fundamental dignity of human beings, regardless of their circumstances or origins. The warmth that enveloped Gimple came not just from the wool fibers, but from generations of American democratic culture that had learned to value compassion above suspicion, generosity above self-protection, and human dignity above ideological purity. The psychological impact on Gimple was immediate and profound. He had expected American civilians to react to obvious foreigners with suspicion, hostility, or indifference based on Nazi intelligence briefings that described Americans as paranoid xenophobes, whose democratic freedoms had been suspended under wartime emergency regulations. Instead, he was experiencing spontaneous kindness from a young man who asked nothing in return and expected no reward for his assistance. The warmth of the blanket seemed to penetrate not just his cold body, but his fundamental assumptions about American character and democratic society. For the first time since beginning his intelligence training, Gimple found himself questioning whether the Nazi characterization of Americans as heartless materialists might be fundamentally incorrect. Mary Forney, a 29-year-old resident of Hancock, who encountered the agents later that morning, provided additional evidence that challenged Nazi stereotypes about American women and democratic society. According to Nazi racial theory, women in democratic societies were supposed to be weak, frivolous creatures whose political opinions were shaped by Jewish media manipulation, and whose moral standards had been corrupted by racial mixing and cultural degeneracy. Instead, Forney demonstrated practical intelligence, moral courage, and genuine concern for human welfare. That contradicted every assumption Nazi ideology made about the effects of democratic freedom on feminine character when Forney offered the agents hot coffee and directions to the nearest town. She was acting according to New England cultural traditions that emphasized hospitality towards strangers and assistance to travelers in distress. Her kitchen, warmed by a wood-burning stove that had served her family for 20 years, represented the kind of comfortable domesticity that Nazi propaganda claimed was impossible in racially diverse democratic societies. The coffee she poured came from beans that had been imported from South America through trade relationships that demonstrated American economic reach and organizational capability. The sugar she offered had been refined in American factories, operating at full capacity, despite wartime demands, while the fresh milk came from local dairy farms that continued to prosper, even as young men left for military service overseas. Her kindness was not calculated to achieve any political or personal advantage, but reflected deeply held values about human dignity and community responsibility that flourished in societies where individual conscience was respected rather than subordinated to state ideology. The coffee she poured represented more than simple refreshment. It symbolized the abundance and generosity that democratic economic systems made possible. Even in wartime conditions, the ceramic cups from which the agents drank had been manufactured in American pottery works that maintained quality standards and aesthetic appeal, even while converting much of their production to military requirements. The tablecloth on which the cups rested had been woven from American cotton, grown in fields worked by free laborers, earning wages that allowed them to purchase the goods they produced. The abundance represented by freely offered food and clothing created additional cognitive dissonance for agents who had been conditioned to believe that American society was on the verge of economic collapse. Under the strain of fighting a global war, Nazi propaganda had consistently predicted that American participation in European conflicts would bankrupt the United States and create domestic shortages that would turn the population against their government. Instead, Gimple and Kolpaw observed American civilians who possessed sufficient material abundance to share resources with complete strangers without apparent concern about scarcity or rationing. The wool blanket that provided warmth against the Maine winter represented industrial and agricultural capabilities that exceeded anything available to German civilians. By late 1944, American sheep production had actually increased during the war years to meet military requirements for woolen uniforms, while simultaneously maintaining civilian supplies adequate for domestic needs. The textile mills that processed the wool operated with efficiency and productivity that German industry could no longer match due to bombing damage, raw material shortages, and labor force disruptions. Most significantly, American families like the Hodgkins possessed sufficient surplus clothing to share with strangers, suggesting living standards that Nazi economics had declared impossible. Under democratic capitalism, the agents observed houses heated adequately throughout the winter, families with multiple sets of clothing for different seasons and occasions, and pantries stocked with preserved foods that could sustain households through months of harsh weather. This material abundance reflected not just natural resource advantages, but economic systems that maximized productive efficiency through voluntary cooperation, technological innovation, and market mechanisms that allocated resources according to consumer preferences rather than centralized planning directives. The quality of American consumer goods also contradicted German intelligence assessments about American industrial capabilities and economic sustainability. The woolen blanket was woven with consistent thread counts and dye patterns that indicated quality control standards, maintained despite wartime production pressures. American civilian clothing worn by Hodgkins and Forney showed signs of good nutrition, adequate health care, and access to consumer goods that had become unavailable to most German civilians by 1944. Even basic items like coffee, sugar, and processed foods were available in quantities that suggested an economy capable of supporting both military requirements and civilian living standards simultaneously. This material abundance reflected deeper economic and social realities that challenged fundamental Nazi assumptions about the relationship between race, culture, and productivity. German economic theory, influenced by Nazi racial ideology, maintained that only racially homogeneous societies could achieve the cultural unity necessary for maximum industrial efficiency. Mixed racial societies like the United States were supposed to waste enormous resources on internal conflicts and political corruption. That made sustained economic growth impossible. The evidence of American prosperity that the agents observed firsthand suggested that democratic societies might actually be more economically productive than totalitarian regimes, contradicting core Nazi beliefs about the superiority of authoritarian organization. The hospitality extended by Maine residents also demonstrated social cohesion that Nazi propaganda insisted was impossible in racially diverse democratic societies. According to German intelligence briefings, American society was supposed to be fragmenting under the stresses of wartime mobilization, with different racial and ethnic groups competing for resources and political influence. Instead, the agents observed American communities that functioned with remarkable efficiency and mutual cooperation despite their ethnic diversity. Local residents helped strangers without apparent concern about their national origin or racial background, suggesting social bonds that transcended the tribal loyalties that Nazi ideology considered the only reliable foundation for political organization. The agents witnessed interactions between Americans of different ethnic backgrounds that contradicted Nazi theories about inevitable racial conflict in diverse societies. Irish-American fishermen worked alongside Italian-American merchants, while Polish-American farmers sold produce to Jewish-American shopkeepers without the tensions that Nazi ideology predicted would tear such communities apart. The local Catholic Church served parishioners whose families had originated in Ireland, Italy, Poland, and French Canada, yet who considered themselves equally American and equally committed to supporting the war effort against fascism. Protestant churches included members whose ancestors had arrived on the Mayflower alongside recent immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Eastern Europe. This religious and ethnic diversity, rather than creating the social chaos that Nazi theory predicted, seemed to strengthen American communities by drawing on cultural traditions that emphasized different aspects of democratic values. Irish-American Catholics contributed traditions of social solidarity and resistance to oppression. Italian-Americans brought family-centered values and entrepreneurial skills. Polish-Americans provided experiences with democratic political organization and opposition to authoritarian rule. Jewish Americans offered intellectual traditions and historical perspectives on the dangers of racial ideology, rather than competing destructively for dominance. These different cultural streams seem to reinforce common commitments to individual freedom, democratic governance, and opposition to totalitarian ideologies. The transformation of the agents' worldview accelerated as they encountered additional examples of American kindness. During their brief period of freedom before capture, local residents provided directions, food, and assistance, without expecting payment or even expressions of gratitude. Shopkeepers accepted their money without suspicious questioning about its source or authenticity. Despite the obvious foreign accents and unusual behavior of customers who seemed unfamiliar with American commercial practices, hotel clerks provided accommodation without demanding extensive identification or registration procedures that might have exposed their false identities. Immediately, every interaction contradicted Nazi expectations about American paranoia, hostility, and racial hatred toward foreigners. The agents had been trained to expect constant surveillance by suspicious civilians who had been encouraged to report unusual behavior to law enforcement authorities. Instead, they found Americans who seemed genuinely trusting and helpful, willing to assume the best about strangers rather than immediately suspecting the worst. This trusting behavior was particularly remarkable, given that the landing occurred during a period of intense concern about German submarine activity off the American coast and widespread awareness that enemy agents might attempt infiltration through isolated coastal areas. Most significantly, the agents began to recognize that American kindness was not the result of naive ignorance about wartime realities, but reflected conscious moral choices made by individuals who understood the risks of helping potential enemies. Maine residents in November 1944 were fully aware that German submarines operated off the American coast and that enemy agents might attempt infiltration through isolated coastal areas. Local newspapers regularly reported U-boat sightings and attacks on American shipping. Coastal defense installations were visible throughout the region, and military personnel were frequently present in local communities. Yet despite this awareness of ongoing threats, civilian residents chose to help suspicious strangers rather than immediately reporting them to authorities. Their decision to help potentially dangerous individuals reflected moral courage and adherence to humanitarian principles that were stronger than wartime fears or patriotic suspicions. American civilians understood that their kindness might be exploited by enemy agents, yet they chose to act according to moral principles that placed human dignity above personal security. This behavior demonstrated cultural values that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible. In democratic societies, where individual self-interest was supposed to override community solidarity and moral obligations to strangers, the woolen blanket that had provided physical comfort during their first hours in America became a symbol of moral strength that forced both agents to confront the possibility that everything they had believed about democratic societies might be fundamentally wrong. If Americans were truly the weak, corrupt, racially inferior people that Nazi propaganda described, how could they demonstrate such consistent generosity toward potential enemies? If democratic societies were really on the verge of collapse under wartime stresses, how could American civilians possess sufficient abundance to share resources freely with strangers? If racial diversity inevitably led to social chaos and political weakness, how could American communities function with such apparent harmony and effectiveness? The capture of both agents within days of their landing provided additional evidence of American institutional competence that contradicted Nazi assessments of democratic inefficiency and corruption. FBI counterintelligence agents had tracked the landing through sophisticated surveillance techniques that German intelligence had not anticipated. The investigation was conducted with professional thoroughness that impressed both prisoners, who had expected American law enforcement to rely on brutal interrogation methods rather than systematic evidence gathering and careful analysis of intelligence information. Federal agents had monitored German radio transmissions, tracked financial transactions, and coordinated with local law enforcement agencies to create a comprehensive surveillance network That identified the agents' activities, without alerting them to the investigation. The technical sophistication of American counterintelligence operations exceeded anything the agents had been trained to expect. From democratic law enforcement agencies, that Nazi theory claimed would be hampered by legal restrictions and political interference. Instead, they encountered professional investigators who combined respect for legal procedures with operational effectiveness that surpassed German Gestapo methods in achieving intelligence objectives. During their detention and trial, both agents experienced treatment that further challenged their preconceptions about American justice and democratic institutions. They were provided with legal representation by competent attorneys who took their responsibilities seriously, despite representing enemy agents who had been caught engaged in espionage activities against the United States. The lawyers explained American legal procedures, advised their clients of their rights under American law, and worked diligently to ensure fair treatment. Throughout the judicial process, medical care was provided by qualified physicians who treated the agents' health problems with the same professional attention they would have given to American citizens. When Gimpel developed a respiratory infection, during his detention, he received antibiotic treatment that was superior to anything available to German civilians in 1944. His cell was heated adequately throughout the winter months, and he was provided with clean clothing, adequate food, and access to reading materials. That included newspapers, magazines, and books that allowed him to monitor the progress of the war. From American perspectives, living conditions during detention exceeded standards available to many German civilians in 1944, let alone prisoners in German custody. American prison facilities provided regular meals that met nutritional requirements, clean water that met public health standards, and sanitation facilities that prevented the spread of disease. The agents were not subjected to overcrowding, deliberate malnutrition, or unsanitary conditions that characterized detention facilities throughout Nazi-controlled Europe. Most remarkably, they were treated as human beings, deserving of basic dignity and respect, rather than as subhuman enemies, whose suffering was irrelevant to their captors. Their trials were conducted according to established legal procedures that protected their rights, even as enemy agents who had been caught engaged in espionage activities on American soil during wartime. They were allowed to present evidence in their defense, cross-examine witnesses against them, and appeal their convictions through established judicial procedures. The trials were conducted in public courtrooms with press coverage that allowed American citizens to observe the proceedings and evaluate the fairness of the judicial process. Defense attorneys were given adequate time to prepare their cases and access to evidence necessary for effective representation. The contrast between American treatment of captured enemies and German treatment of prisoners created additional cognitive dissonance that forced both men to reevaluate their fundamental beliefs about the nature of civilization and human dignity. German concentration camps and Gestapo interrogation centers had become synonymous with systematic brutality, designed to dehumanize prisoners and break their psychological resistance through calculated cruelty. Torture was routine, medical care was deliberately withheld, and prisoners were subjected to conditions designed to accelerate death through disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. American detention facilities, while certainly restrictive and uncomfortable, maintained basic standards of human dignity that recognize the fundamental worth of individual human beings, regardless of their nationality or political allegiances. Guards treated prisoners with professional courtesy rather than deliberate cruelty. Medical staff provided treatment for illness and injury without regard to the prisoner's crimes or political beliefs. Administrative personnel maintained accurate records and followed established procedures that protected prisoners from arbitrary punishment or neglect. The woolen blanket that had first demonstrated American kindness became part of a broader pattern of humane treatment that suggested democratic societies possessed moral qualities that totalitarian regimes could neither understand nor duplicate. The blanket's warmth had been freely given, without expectation of reward or recognition, reflecting cultural values that placed human welfare above ideological considerations. American prison guards who provided adequate food, medical care, and legal protection were acting according to similar moral principles that viewed even enemy agents as human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. Both agents eventually renounced their Nazi allegiances and cooperated fully with American authorities, providing intelligence that helped prevent other German espionage operations and contributed to Allied understanding of German intelligence capabilities and limitations. Their transformation from enemy agents to cooperative witnesses reflected not just personal conversion experiences, but the power of democratic values to appeal to universal human aspirations for dignity, freedom, and moral community that transcended national boundaries and ideological differences. Gimpel's post-war testimony described his experience of American kindness as the beginning of a spiritual and intellectual awakening that led him to reject everything he had previously believed about race, nationality, and human nature. The woolen blanket that had protected him from the Maine winter had also protected him from the moral coldness of Nazi ideology, providing warmth that extended far beyond physical comfort to encompass emotional and spiritual dimensions of human experience that totalitarian systems could neither provide nor understand. In his detailed debriefing sessions with American intelligence officers, Gimpel described how each act of American kindness had challenged specific aspects of Nazi indoctrination. The spontaneous generosity of Harvard Hodgkins contradicted teachings about American selfishness and materialism. Mary Forney's genuine concern for their welfare disproved Nazi theories about the moral corruption of women in democratic societies. The professional competence of FBI agents demonstrated institutional effectiveness that surpassed German security services. Despite operating within constitutional and legal constraints that Nazi theory claimed would paralyze democratic law enforcement, the broader implications of this encounter between Nazi agents and Maine civilians extended far beyond individual conversion experiences to illuminate fundamental differences between democratic and totalitarian approaches to human dignity and social organization. The spontaneous kindness shown by Harvard Hodgkins and Mary Forney represented cultural values that flourished when individuals were free to act according to their moral convictions, rather than state-imposed ideological requirements. Their behavior demonstrated that democratic societies could produce citizens whose moral character exceeded anything achievable through totalitarian indoctrination and social control. The abundance that enabled Americans to share resources freely with strangers also reflected economic systems that rewarded individual initiative, protected property rights, and encouraged innovation in ways that maximized productive capacity while maintaining living standards for the entire population. The contrast between American prosperity and German wartime shortages illustrated the superior efficiency of market economies operating within democratic political frameworks that protected individual rights and encouraged voluntary cooperation rather than coercive coordination. Democratic societies had proven capable of mobilizing enormous resources for military purposes, while simultaneously maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded peacetime levels. In totalitarian countries, American industrial production had doubled between 1940 and 1944, while civilian consumption remained adequate to support acts of generosity towards strangers. German industrial production, despite the use of slave labor and the elimination of consumer goods manufacturing, had peaked in 1943 and was declining rapidly under the pressure of Allied bombing and resource shortages. Most significantly, the humane treatment of captured enemy agents demonstrated that democratic institutions could maintain their moral principles even under the extreme stress of global warfare against ideological enemies who showed no similar restraint in their treatment of prisoners and civilians. American adherence to legal procedures, protection of individual rights, and maintenance of basic humanitarian standards reflected institutional strength and cultural confidence that totalitarian regimes could neither achieve nor comprehend. The woolen blanket that had provided warmth on a cold Maine morning thus became a symbol of democratic civilization's capacity to maintain human dignity and moral values under conditions that tested the fundamental character of political systems and cultural institutions. In the simple gesture of offering comfort to strangers, American civilians had demonstrated qualities of spontaneous generosity, moral courage, and humanitarian concern that represented the highest aspirations of democratic society and the enduring appeal of political systems built on respect for individual dignity and human rights. The threads of wool that had been spun by Maine sheep, woven by American textile workers, and knitted by a grandmother's loving hands, carried within them the accumulated moral wisdom of a democratic civilization that understood human dignity as the foundation of all legitimate political authority and social organization. When Harvard Hodgkins wrapped that blanket around the shoulders of a German spy, he was unconsciously demonstrating the power of democratic values to transcend the artificial divisions of nationality, race, and ideology that totalitarian systems used to justify hatred, oppression, and war. In the warmth of that simple woolen blanket lay the seeds of understanding that would ultimately triumph over the cold ideology of racial superiority and national hatred that had plunged the world into its most devastating conflict. The kindness of ordinary Americans toward their enemies proved more powerful than Nazi propaganda, more persuasive than ideological indoctrination, and more enduring than the temporary military advantages that had once made German victory seem inevitable. In choosing compassion over suspicion, generosity over self-protection, and human dignity over ideological purity, the people of Maine had demonstrated the moral foundations that would enable democratic civilization to survive its greatest test and emerge stronger, wiser, and more committed to the principles of human freedom and dignity that makes civilization possible